Long before the world came to associate America's black population solely with the chains of slavery, there were men and women whose lives told a different story, one of resilience, learning, and self-determination. Imagine bustling colonial towns where free black families owned homes, ran businesses, and sent their children to school. These were not distant dreams, but real communities that thrived even before slavery became the law of the land. Their existence challenges what many of us think we know about early American history, and invites us to look deeper into a hidden past that has been overlooked for centuries. Picture a time in the early 1600s when the first Africans arrived in Virginia. They did not all come as lifelong slaves. Many were indentured servants, much like poor Europeans, bound by temporary contracts and destined to earn their freedom through years of labor. When their terms ended, some were granted land and the right to build lives of their own. These free men and women carved out space in a young nation that was still defining itself, proving that black ambition and achievement existed from the very start. Their stories are as inspiring as they are surprising. Some became skilled artisans and merchants. Others were educators, leaders, or spiritual guides for their communities. They learned to read and write, to navigate the complex laws of the colonies, and to protect their families in a world where freedom was fragile. They gathered in meeting houses, published their thoughts in newspapers, and left behind records that show a vibrant culture of intellect and pride. Long before the word abolition stirred political debate, these individuals embodied the truth that human dignity cannot be contained. Why have these voices been nearly forgotten? Perhaps because their lives contradict the simple narrative of people defined only by bondage. Yet remembering them changes how we see the birth of America itself. It reveals that black excellence, creativity, and determination were not responses to slavery alone, but qualities present from the earliest days. Their courage to live freely in a society not built for them speaks to the universal struggle for justice and recognition. If you find this hidden chapter of history as fascinating as we do, join us as we uncover more stories of courage and achievement that history books often leave behind. Your support helps bring these remarkable lives into the light. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends who love exploring the untold sides of history. Together, we can make sure these powerful stories are heard and remembered. When we step back into the early 17th century, we often picture the first arrival of Africans in Virginia as the beginning of an unbroken story of slavery. But the reality was far more complex and unexpected. In 1619, a small group of men and women from Africa disembarked on the shores of the English colony, not as lifelong property but as indentured servants, bound by contracts that resembled those of the poor Europeans who stood beside them in the tobacco fields. These Africans entered a world still trying to define its own rules, where the lines between freedom and servitude had not yet hardened into the cruel permanence we associate with later centuries. Like the impoverished English and Irish laborers who crossed the Atlantic seeking a better life, they were expected to work for a set number of years to repay the cost of their passage. At the end of their service, they would be entitled to something remarkable: freedom, and in many cases, a chance to claim land of their own. It is difficult to imagine the courage it took to begin life in a raw and unformed colony, a place where survival was not guaranteed and where the rules were written almost daily. Yet these Africans adapted swiftly, drawing on skills and strength carried from their homelands, and they became more than laborers. They learned to navigate the rhythms of the plantation economy and to understand the legal customs of the English settlers. For some, this meant becoming farmers in their own right once their contracts ended. Land ownership in those early days was more than wealth. It was a passport to recognition, a claim to a place in society, and a shield against the instability of life on the edge of a vast and still mysterious continent. To own land was to be acknowledged as a person with rights, a citizen in the making. And for these early Africans, it marked a path toward dignity in a world that might have denied it. Stories survive of men and women who turned their hard-won freedom into lasting legacies. Anthony Johnson, once an indentured servant from Angola, became one of the most prominent examples. After years of service, he secured his liberty and went on to establish a prosperous tobacco farm. He acquired land, hired workers, and raised a family whose name was known across the region. His success was not an isolated miracle. It reflected the fluid nature of early Virginia, when the social hierarchy had not yet calcified into a rigid racial order. Africans and Europeans worked side by side, and while prejudice certainly existed, the laws did not yet declare one group forever subordinate to another. In these early decades, opportunity, though hard-won and fragile, was real. These men and women also brought with them a sense of community and cultural memory that shaped their new environment. They built homes, worshipped together, and passed on traditions even as they absorbed elements of English customs. Some married into European families, while others formed networks of support among fellow Africans and freed servants of every origin. They planted not only crops but also the seeds of a society where black people could be landowners, tradespeople, and active participants in public life. Their presence challenged the notion that freedom and achievement were reserved for any one race, and their determination revealed a truth about human ambition that no legal code could permanently suppress. But the path ahead would not remain open forever. As the tobacco economy grew and the demand for labor increased, colonial leaders began to see a different kind of system as more profitable. Laws were gradually rewritten to distinguish African laborers from their European counterparts, turning temporary contracts into lifelong bondage and passing the status of slavery from parent to child. The freedoms once attainable for Africans in Virginia became more and more rare as the 17th century wore. Yet the early period, when the first Africans could and did earn their independence, remains a powerful reminder that the history of black people in America is not solely a narrative of enslavement. It began with individuals who proved their ability to thrive in freedom, even when the world around them was still unsure of their place. Their stories complicate the easy stereotypes of the colonial era and reveal that the American experiment was always shaped by diversity and by the struggle for opportunity. These first Africans were pioneers of a different kind, not merely survivors but builders of a future that might have been far more inclusive had those early possibilities endured. To remember them is to honor a chapter of history that challenges us to rethink the origins of both liberty and inequality in the United States. They remind us that black agency and achievement were present from the very first pages of the nation's story, and that before chains defined the centuries to come, there were people who walked these shores as free men and women, carving their own destiny from the soil of a young and unsteady world. For a brief moment in the early history of Virginia, the colony seemed to stand at a crossroads where freedom might be possible for all who labored to build it. Africans who had arrived as indentured servants worked their years alongside poor Europeans, and some emerged from their contracts as landowners and heads of households, proving that skill and perseverance could win a place in a society still taking shape. But as the decades passed and the tobacco fields demanded ever more hands, the ambitions of wealthy planters and the anxieties of colonial leaders began to harden into law. What had once been a landscape of shifting possibilities was slowly transformed by a series of decisions that would change countless lives and shape the future of a nation. Step by step, Virginia's lawmakers began to create a system designed not just to provide labor but to fix the status of an entire people for generations. The first measures were subtle, almost bureaucratic, but their consequences were immense. Early in the 17th century, English settlers viewed servitude as a temporary condition, whether for Europeans or Africans. Yet as planters realized that the high mortality rates were declining and that indentured workers might survive their contracts, they saw the limits of a system that required them to release laborers and perhaps even grant them land. The prospect of a growing class of free men and women, especially those of African descent, threatened both their economic plans and their sense of social order. Slowly, laws began to appear that treated Africans differently from their European counterparts, not because of any formal decree at first, but because of an evolving understanding that their labor could be exploited without end. By 1661, the shift had become unmistakable. The Virginia Assembly passed legislation declaring that people of African descent could be held as servants for life, a decision that marked the birth of a fully racialized system of bondage. No longer would contracts aspire to release men and women into a life of freedom and property ownership. Instead, the colony decreed that black laborers and their children would be bound forever. What had been a society of fluid possibilities turned into one where the color of a person's skin determined their destiny before they could even speak their first words. It was not only the individuals who had once dreamed of independence who were affected. Entire generations yet unborn were condemned to a life without the hope of lawful liberty. This new legal reality reshaped the landscape of families and communities. Those early Africans who had earned freedom and built farms suddenly faced a terrifying uncertainty, watching as neighbors and relatives were drawn into a system from which there was no escape. Some who had secured property clung to their status with all their strength. But the tightening of the laws meant that even free black families lived under the shadow of suspicion and the constant risk of being stripped of their rights. Marriages between Africans and Europeans, once a quiet fact of life, came under increasing scrutiny, and children of mixed heritage were more and more often classified according to the status of their mothers. If she was enslaved, so too would the child be, regardless of the father's position or intentions. These changes did not happen in isolation. Across the Atlantic world, the growing demand for tobacco and other colonial goods encouraged investors to look for the most profitable means of production. The idea of a permanent, inheritable labor force was attractive to those who sought wealth from the soil, and Virginia became a proving ground for a system that would spread across the southern colonies. The laws of 1661 and those that followed in the decades after laid the foundation for what came to be known as chattel slavery, a form of human bondage unprecedented in its scope and permanence. In place of the hopeful stories of men and women who had once worked their way to freedom, there arose a new narrative of generational captivity, where a child's future was sealed at birth. For the Africans who had arrived in those early years as indentured servants, the transformation was devastating. Their memories of a time when freedom could be earned became living testimony to what had been lost. Some, like Anthony Johnson and his family, managed to hold on to land and status for a time. But the tightening grip of racial legislation eroded the fragile space they had carved out. Courts increasingly favored white planters in disputes, and even long-established free black families found themselves pushed to the margins or forced to leave the colony altogether. The promise that had once existed in Virginia's early days faded into a harsh reality. The colony had chosen a path that bound Africans and their descendants in a system designed to enrich a few at the cost of countless lives. This turning point in Virginia was more than a local decision. It was a defining moment for what would become the United States. The choice to make slavery lifelong and hereditary created economic foundations that fueled colonial growth, but it also planted the seeds of future conflicts and moral reckonings. It revealed how fear and the hunger for profit could override the fragile ideals of equality and opportunity that some settlers once cherished. The voices of those first Africans who earned their freedom before the laws changed remain a powerful reminder that America's history was never destined to be a simple story of oppression or liberty. It was a contested ground where choices made by legislators and landowners in pursuit of gain forever altered the path of a people and left an enduring mark on the nation's conscience. By understanding how Virginia moved from a society of potential mobility to one of hereditary slavery, we gain more than a lesson in colonial history. We see how the lives of individuals who once stood as proof of black self-determination were deliberately written out of the promise of freedom. and how a young society, eager for wealth, chose to enshrine equality in its very laws. Their struggle and the laws that sought to erase it continue to echo through the centuries, a reminder that the story of liberty in America has always been shadowed by the choices made in those early days when a colony decided whose dreams would be honored and whose would be denied. As the laws of Virginia hardened and the dream of earned freedom slipped further away for many Africans and their descendants, the story of struggle and determination did not end. Across the Atlantic world, a few remarkable individuals proved that even in an age designed to silence black voices, brilliance and courage could break through. Among the most inspiring was Olaudah Equiano, a man whose life traced a path from captivity to self-liberation, and then to a role as one of the most powerful advocates for the end of the very system that once sought to define him. His journey gives life to the idea that human dignity can endure even in the face of unimaginable obstacles. And it links directly to the earlier generation of free blacks in America who had once shown that education, ambition, and resilience were possible long before emancipation became a political cause. Equiano was born far from the shores of Virginia, in what is now Nigeria, and as a young boy he knew the rhythms and traditions of his Igbo homeland. That world was shattered when he was kidnapped and forced across the Atlantic in the brutal trade that was gathering strength, just as Virginia's laws of hereditary slavery took hold. His early experiences were marked by terror and displacement. Yet he quickly demonstrated the same qualities of adaptability and resolve that had once allowed Africans in early Virginia to earn their freedom through skill and endurance. Sold into the maritime world of the British Empire, he worked aboard trading ships and naval vessels. Learning languages, navigation, and the subtle art of survival in a society that rarely acknowledged the humanity of those it enslaved. It was through the very skills he developed at sea that Equiano found a path toward freedom, while the planters of Virginia tightened the chains of hereditary bondage. He saved every possible coin from the wages he was occasionally permitted to keep. Patiently and with unwavering focus, he purchased his own liberty, turning the tools of commerce into instruments of personal emancipation. This act of buying his freedom was more than a transaction. It was a declaration that his life belonged to him and a direct challenge to the idea that black people were destined only for servitude. In this, Equiano mirrored the earliest free blacks of Virginia who, decades before, had seized opportunities to own land and build families despite the growing pressures of racial hierarchy. Once free, Equiano did not retreat into a quiet life. He became a traveler, a man of the world who crossed oceans and cultures, and he transformed his personal story into a powerful weapon against the slave trade. His autobiography, published in 1789 as the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, combined the vivid detail of a seafarer's adventures with a searing indictment of the inhumanity of slavery. Readers across Britain and beyond were moved not only by his testimony of suffering, but by the clarity and intelligence with which he spoke. His words gave a human face to the millions whose lives were stolen by the transatlantic slave trade, and his book became a cornerstone of the growing abolitionist movement. At a time when the voices of the enslaved were rarely heard in public debate, Equiano stood as living proof of black intellect, eloquence, and moral authority. His influence extended beyond the printed page. Equiano spoke at gatherings, met with political leaders, and became a tireless advocate for the abolition of the slave trade, lending credibility to a cause that was gaining momentum but still faced fierce opposition. He understood that his own freedom carried a responsibility to those still in bondage, and he used every ounce of his education and experience to press the case for justice. His efforts helped pave the way for the landmark British legislation of 1807 that ended the transatlantic slave trade. And though he did not live to see that victory, his voice was among those that made it possible. Equiano's life story resonates deeply with the history of early free blacks in America. Like those first Africans in Virginia who earned land and status before the laws of 1661 closed the door, he demonstrated that black excellence was not a product of benevolence or chance, but the result of courage, intellect, and relentless determination. His achievements exposed the falsehood of racial inferiority and revealed the capacity for leadership and creativity that oppressive systems sought to deny. He embodied the same spirit of those early pioneers whose freedom once hinted at a more inclusive America, and he carried their legacy across oceans, transforming personal triumph into a force for global change. By placing Equiano's story alongside the history of Virginia's first Africans, we can see a broader pattern of resistance and achievement. From the indentured servants who once earned their liberty on American soil to the writer and abolitionist who used his pen to strike at the very heart of the slave trade. These lives remind us that the history of black people in the Atlantic world is not only one of suffering, but also of extraordinary resilience and agency. Equiano's narrative, like the early free black communities of Virginia, stands as a testament to the enduring truth that human dignity cannot be erased by law or custom. In their stories we find the roots of a long struggle for freedom, a struggle that began long before abolition was a movement and that continues to inspire those who believe in justice and equality today. While Virginia's lawmakers were entrenching slavery and men like Oloda Equiano were turning their hard-won freedom into a call for abolition, a different transformation was beginning to take root farther north. There, the winds of change carried with them a quiet but steady movement toward a society where the ideals of liberty, though imperfectly realized, opened new doors for black men and women who sought more than mere survival. Beginning in the late 18th century and gathering strength in the early years of the new republic, several northern states embarked on a path of gradual abolition. This was not a sudden revolution, but a slow and deliberate reshaping of law and custom. And it offered free blacks a chance to claim the very opportunities that had once been wrested away in the southern colonies. Out of these shifting landscapes grew vibrant communities where education, skilled trades, and a sense of collective purpose took root and flourished, carrying forward the spirit of those first Africans in Virginia who had once tasted the possibilities of freedom. These northern states, places like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, and later others, were driven by a mix of religious conviction, political ideals, and economic change. Their leaders began to recognize that a nation founded on the rhetoric of liberty could not forever reconcile that principle with the bondage of human beings. Laws emerged that promised freedom for future generations or set timetables for the emancipation of those still held in servitude, for those who had long lived under the shadow of slavery. These laws were more than legal documents. They were signals that the tide of history might yet bend toward justice. Families who had endured decades of insecurity could now imagine a future in which their children would not be born into chains. It was a hope fragile and hard-won, but it opened a path that countless free blacks would follow. As emancipation slowly took effect, black families from the South and from within the North itself began to migrate toward these states, drawn by the promise of a freer life. The journeys were often perilous and the reception far from uniformly warm. Yet the chance to settle in places where slavery's grip was loosening inspired courage and determination. These migrants carried with them the memory of struggle, memories like those of the early free blacks in Virginia who had once secured land and dignity before oppressive laws closed in. They arrived in northern towns and cities determined to build something lasting, to create communities where black excellence could not merely survive but thrive. Urban centers became the crucibles of this transformation. Cities such as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York grew into hubs of black culture, commerce, and political activism. In neighborhoods alive with the sound of church bells and the bustle of market streets, free blacks founded mutual aid societies, established schools, and opened businesses that served both their own communities and the wider public. Churches became more than houses of worship. They were centers of learning, meeting halls for debate, and sanctuaries where a people could chart their future. Within these spaces, education was not a luxury but a necessity, a means of securing dignity and asserting equality in a society that still doubted both. Parents who remembered the fragility of freedom worked tirelessly to ensure that their children could read, write, and master the trades that would grant them independence. Skilled trades in particular offered a road to economic stability and respect. Black artisans became tailors, blacksmiths, carpenters, and sailors. Women ran boarding houses, seamstress shops, and small markets. Their success proved that ability and ambition could flourish despite the lingering prejudice of a society still marked by racial boundaries. Schools founded by black leaders and allies nurtured a generation of thinkers and writers whose words and ideas would fuel the abolitionist movement and challenge the conscience of the nation. In these northern communities, the legacy of people like Olaudah Equiano found fertile ground. His writings and the testimony of other formerly enslaved individuals inspired both black and white audiences to push for a broader end to slavery and for recognition of black citizenship. Yet life in the North was far from free of struggle. Discrimination and violence still cast long shadows, and opportunities were often limited by the same racial prejudice that gripped the South. Black families were sometimes forced into the poorest neighborhoods, denied political rights, or targeted by mobs who resented their growing presence. But even in the face of these obstacles, the resolve to build and to educate never wavered. The very act of creating schools and mutual aid societies was a quiet form of resistance, a declaration that no amount of hostility could erase the dignity and aspirations of a people determined to shape their own destiny. In these urban enclaves of the North, one can trace a direct line back to the earliest chapters of black history in America. The free blacks who first earned their independence in Virginia before the tightening of the slave laws. The self-emancipated voices like Equiano who turned personal triumph into a global call for abolition. And the families who now forge communities in Philadelphia or New York were all part of a single, unbroken story. It was the story of a people who refused to be defined solely by the chains others sought to place upon them. Their pursuit of education and skilled trades was not merely about survival. It was about claiming a rightful place in the life of the nation and proving that black excellence had deep roots and limitless potential. By the dawn of the 19th century, these northern communities stood as living evidence that the ideals of liberty could be more than words on paper. They demonstrated that when given even a narrow opening, black men and women could build institutions of learning, commerce, and culture that enriched not only their own lives but the fabric of American society as a whole. Their determination echoed the resilience of those who came before and set the stage for the movements that would follow, movements that would challenge the nation to fulfill the promise of freedom for all. In their schools and workshops, in their churches and meeting halls, the descendants of those first free Africans and the newly emancipated alike carried forward a vision of dignity and possibility, a vision that continues to inspire anyone who believes that human potential cannot be bound by law or prejudice. From the bustling streets of Philadelphia to the busy port neighborhoods of New York and the quiet yet determined quarters of Boston, the free black communities that had taken root in the wake of Northern abolition became more than a collection of families seeking safety. They evolved into dynamic centers of culture, intellect, and enterprise. Their growth was not an accident of geography or mere chance, but the deliberate result of people who understood that freedom demanded more than the absence of chains. It required voices, institutions, and a lasting record of thought. In these spaces, the descendants of the first Africans who had earned their liberty in Virginia, the followers of Olaudah Equiano's call for dignity, and those who had braved the migration north found themselves united by a shared purpose, to build a world where education and ideas could stand as powerful weapons against the prejudice that still threatened their existence. Newspapers became their chosen battleground. Black editors and writers recognized that to be heard in a society reluctant to listen, they needed their own presses and their own pages. The printing shops that sprang up in northern cities were not merely businesses. They were beacons of self-determination. Publications such as Freedom's Journal in New York or the Christian Recorder in Philadelphia carried essays that challenged the nation's conscience, reported on the achievements of black artisans and scholars, and offered a forum where their communities could debate politics, literature, and the pressing moral questions of the day. Every issue was more than ink on paper. It was a declaration of presence and a refusal to be silenced. The newspapers connected distant neighborhoods, linking church congregations, mutual aid societies, and reform movements into a single, vibrant network of information and inspiration. Alongside the newspapers, schools became the heart of this intellectual awakening. In church basements, private homes, and rented halls, free blacks established schools where children learned not only to read and write, but to think critically and imagine futures that earlier generations had scarcely dared to dream. Education was no longer the privilege of a few fortunate individuals. It became the shared mission of entire communities. Parents who had themselves been denied the right to education saved every spare coin to ensure their children could hold books and master the skills of literacy and arithmetic. Teachers, often drawn from among the most dedicated and talented members of these neighborhoods, saw their work as sacred, a calling as urgent as any sermon preached from the pulpit. These schools often faced hostility from those who feared an educated black population. Yet they endured. They forged a culture in which learning was celebrated and knowledge was power. Graduates of these early schools carried their training into the trades, the arts, and in some cases into higher education, shattering the myth that black intellect was somehow limited or unworthy of the nation's great institutions. Colleges such as Oberlin in Ohio opened their doors to black students, and families who had built their own schools now sent sons and daughters to study alongside white peers, creating a new generation of leaders and thinkers who would become lawyers, ministers, writers, and advocates for justice. Their success echoed the spirit of those early free Africans who had once earned land and respect in Virginia and of Oloda Equiano, whose writings had inspired a broader fight against the slave trade. The impact of these achievements reached far beyond the walls of classrooms or the pages of newspapers. Literary societies flourished, where men and women gathered to debate philosophy, discuss the latest with poetry and science, and exchange ideas about how to secure the rights and freedoms still denied to so many of their brethren. These societies were incubators of leadership and creativity, cultivating voices that would later become central to the movements for abolition and civil rights. They forged bonds across communities, knitting together networks of activists, entrepreneurs, and educators who believed that the written word and the disciplined mind could chip away at the walls of prejudice and open a path toward equality. This cultural flowering was not an escape from the harsh realities of racism, but a direct challenge to it. Each book published, each school opened, each editorial printed was an act of defiance against a society that too often sought to confine black ambition to the margins. By producing their own newspapers and founding their own schools, free blacks demonstrated that they were not waiting for permission to participate in the intellectual and cultural life of the nation. They were, instead, shaping it from within, proving that the ideals of liberty and enlightenment belonged to them as much as to anyone. Through their presses and classrooms, they preserved the memory of those who had come before, the early free black Virginians who had tasted liberty before it was snatched away, the northern migrants who had sought a better life, and figures like Equiano who had turned personal freedom into a worldwide appeal for justice. At the same time, they created a living heritage for those who would follow. Their newspapers chronicled the triumphs and struggles of their communities. Their schools nurtured children who would become the thinkers and activists of the next century. The intellectual foundations they laid in those decades would nourish the great abolitionist movement and later the civil rights struggles, ensuring that the voices of Black America could never again be written out of the nation's story. By the mid-19th century, these free Black communities had proven beyond doubt that education and culture could flourish, even in the face of prejudice and exclusion. Their newspapers and schools stood as monuments to resilience and creativity, and the scholars, writers, and orators they produced would carry forward a legacy of excellence and determination. The path they blazed from the first Africans who arrived as indentured servants, through the era of harsh slave codes, past the inspirational life of Olaudah Equiano, and into the urban renaissance of the North, was a single narrative of courage and vision. It was the story of a people who understood that freedom was more than a legal status. It was the power to think, to speak, and to shape the future. And through their relentless pursuit of knowledge and their commitment to telling their own story, they ensured that the foundations of Black intellectual and cultural life in America would remain unshakable for generations to come. Amid the rising hum of Black newspapers and the steady rhythm of classrooms built by free communities in the North, another, more complex layer of the story began to emerge, revealing how the long and often painful encounters between African and European peoples had shaped lives in ways both tragic and transformative. Among the growing population of free Blacks, there were men and women whose path to liberty traced not only to acts of personal courage or the slow march of Northern abolition, but also to family ties that crossed the rigid color lines of the era. Some were the sons and daughters of white fathers, planters, merchants, artisans, or occasionally men of influence who had acknowledged their children in quiet ways or, in some cases, made provisions for their freedom. Their presence added a new dimension to the evolving Black experience in America. For these individuals often inherited something more than freedom. They inherited access to education, property, and social connections that allowed them to stand in a space between worlds and form a distinct class within their own people. Their story intertwined seamlessly with that of the earlier free Black Virginians who had once held land before harsh laws tried to strip them of their rights. With the memory of Olaudah Equiano, who turned personal freedom into a platform for global change. And with the Northern migrants who built the schools and presses that gave Black voices a permanent place in American life. But these children of mixed heritage carried both the privileges and the burdens of their unique position. In cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Baltimore, they often grew up with an education that rivaled that of white peers, sometimes studying languages or mathematics under private tutors or at schools their fathers quietly financed. Some were trained in the skilled trades carpentry, masonry, metalwork that brought both income and status. Others were given small parcels of land or sums of money that allowed them to establish businesses, purchase homes, or support churches and schools. This access to education and property did more than provide comfort. It created the foundations of a recognizable social stratum that would influence Black culture for generations. In neighborhoods where free Black presses were already publishing newspapers, and where ambitious families fought for every opportunity to educate their children, these mixed heritage men and women became visible symbols of what was possible when barriers of race and class were even slightly breached. They hosted salons and gatherings where ideas flowed freely, where debates about politics, literature, and religion filled the air with the same urgency that animated the abolitionist papers. Some sponsored schools or donated to churches that doubled as community centers, weaving themselves into the fabric of a broader movement that saw education not merely as a means to advancement, but as the most powerful instrument of liberation. Yet their existence also exposed the contradictions of an America that proclaimed liberty while preserving inequality. For every white father who left an inheritance or arranged for his child's schooling, there were countless others who denied any connection, leaving mothers to struggle alone against poverty and prejudice. The privileges enjoyed by a few could never erase the pain of a system that still treated black lives as less than equal, and within the black community itself, this emerging class sometimes faced suspicion or resentment, for their lighter skin or inherited wealth set them apart from those who had fought for every scrap of opportunity. They walked a delicate line, aware that their fortunes were shaped in part by the very racial boundaries they longed to see dismantled. Still, many among this group chose to use their advantages for the good of all. They became teachers, editors, merchants, and organizers, lending their resources and their education to the common cause of racial uplift. They funded newspapers that carried the voices of Black America across the northern states, joined literary societies where strategies for civil rights were debated, and supported the schools that had become the beating heart of free black life. Their contributions helped solidify the cultural and intellectual foundations already laid by the pioneers of northern black communities and ensured that the fight for equality would be carried forward by men and women armed not only with passion, but with the tools of learning and the confidence of property ownership. Their existence also forced the broader society to confront its own hypocrisies. These were not distant strangers but children of white fathers, often bearing a family name or a striking resemblance that could not easily be denied. Their success challenged the myth that race alone determined intellect or worth. In salons and lecture halls, in the editorials of black newspapers, and in the quiet perseverance of black teachers, their presence demanded recognition of a shared humanity that the laws of slavery and segregation sought to obscure. As the 19th century moved forward, the story of these free blacks of mixed parentage became inseparable from the larger narrative of Black America's pursuit of freedom and self-definition. They were a bridge between the earliest free Africans who had once owned land in Virginia before the tightening of slave codes, the powerful voice of Olaudah Equiano, who proved the pen could be mightier than the chain, and the northern communities whose newspapers and schools transformed the meaning of liberty. Their lives embodied the contradictions of a nation wrestling with its own ideals and revealed how, even within a society built on division, the bonds of family and the determination to educate and uplift could carve out spaces of dignity and possibility. By drawing on the advantages granted by education and property, they helped create a class of black leaders and thinkers who would shape culture, politics, and civil society for decades to come. They stood as living proof that freedom was more than an abstract promise. It could be cultivated, expanded, and defended, even in the face of persistent prejudice. Their presence reinforced the growing conviction, voiced in the pages of black newspapers and in the lessons of black schools, that the future of their people would be defined not by the limits imposed by others, but by the courage to claim and share the tools of knowledge, enterprise, and community. And in doing so, they secured their place in the unfolding American story, a testament to resilience and a reminder that the quest for equality has always been shaped by those willing to build bridges across the deepest divides. By the time the 19th century had reached its midpoint, the world that free black men and women had carefully built in the northern cities had taken on a richness and complexity that would have astonished those first Africans who once worked under contracts in Virginia, or those who fought to secure liberty in the shadow of tightening slave laws. From the earliest hints of freedom in the 17th century to the slow tide of northern abolition, from the defiant voice of Olaudah Equiano to the mixed heritage families who forged opportunity from a history of struggle, every chapter of this story had laid another stone in the foundation of a society determined to flourish against all odds. Out of these generations of resilience emerged, by the mid-1800s, a striking new reality. In the heart of America's urban centers, a class of free black citizens had fashioned a culture of refinement and stability so strong that it could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Baltimore became the stage on which this transformation unfolded. Within neighborhoods alive with the sounds of black-owned printing presses and the lessons of schools founded by northern migrants, a distinctive elite began to take shape. These men and women were the heirs of those who had risked everything to escape bondage. The descendants of mixed heritage families who had turned education and property into a shield against poverty, and the students of teachers who believed that learning was the surest path to dignity. They carried forward the legacy of those who had published newspapers, run schools, and debated the nation's conscience. But now they added to it the polish of a self-sustaining culture. Their homes became centers of art, music, and conversation, where the ideals of leadership and civic duty mingled naturally with the pursuit of beauty and knowledge. This emerging black elite placed a high value on education, not simply as a means of personal advancement, but as the lifeblood of the community's future. They founded and supported academies, funded libraries, and encouraged young men and women to seek higher learning in the few colleges that would admit them. Their children grew up surrounded by books and the expectation that they would carry the banner of leadership into the next generation. Marriages were often formed within this circle, not out of exclusion, but out of a shared commitment to preserving the hard-won gains of freedom and ensuring that the culture of learning and moral integrity remained strong. These unions created networks of families bound not only by affection but by a sense of collective purpose, reinforcing a stability that the wider nation often denied to people of African descent. Their gatherings were more than social occasions. They were crucibles of ideas where sermons of justice mingled with plans for schools, lectures on literature, and strategies for political action. In the parlors of well-kept townhouses and the halls of black churches that doubled as meeting places, men and women discussed abolition, civil rights, and the responsibilities of those who had achieved a measure of success. Some hosted musical evenings where the works of European composers shared space with African American spirituals, a blending of cultural traditions that reflected both pride in heritage and confidence in the universal language of art. The grace and discipline of these communities stood as a quiet rebuke to the stereotypes and prejudices that sought to confine black people to the margins of American life. Yet this refined class was not detached from the struggles of the wider black population. Many of its leaders dedicated their wealth and influence to the fight against slavery and the effort to secure rights for all. They raised funds for abolitionist newspapers, organized schools for children newly freed from bondage, and lent their voices to petitions and protests. Their example showed that refinement and activism were not opposing forces, but could work in harmony to challenge injustice. By cultivating their own culture of excellence, they provided living proof that African Americans could shape their destiny, that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, education, and communal strength. The formation of this elite also deepened the narrative of black resilience that had been unfolding for generations. It echoed the courage of the first free Africans who once worked side by side with poor Europeans in Virginia before laws of hereditary bondage closed the door to liberty. It carried forward the determination of those who, like Equiano, transformed personal freedom into a platform for global change. It built upon the mixed heritage families who used education and property to carve out space for leadership. And it drew strength from the bustling northern neighborhoods where free blacks had long published newspapers and opened schools, laying the intellectual groundwork for the future. By the middle of the 19th century, these men and women had proven that their achievements were not accidents of circumstance, but the fruit of sustained effort and collective vision. They had married within their class not to exclude, but to protect and nurture a fragile yet flourishing culture. They had turned their homes into centers of leadership and their lives into examples of how freedom, once gained, could be shaped into something enduring. Their existence challenged a nation still wrestling with slavery and racial hierarchy, offering a living testament that black excellence was not a distant ideal but a present reality. Their story reminds us that the pursuit of liberty is not a single dramatic event but a long, patient labor. From the earliest contracts of the first Africans in Virginia to the refined parlors of the mid-19th century black elite, every generation left its mark, each building upon the sacrifices and triumphs of those before. In their resilience, their devotion to education, and their commitment to leadership, these urban pioneers secured a place for themselves and for future generations, proving that even in the face of persistent prejudice, a people could rise, create, and lead with dignity and grace. As the 19th century rolled toward its turbulent second half, the carefully cultivated world of the northern black elite, those men and women who had turned education, property, and leadership into a culture of refinement, faced a profound and unexpected test. The Civil War shattered the legal structure of slavery in the South, and with emancipation came a great movement of newly freed people, carrying both hopes and heartbreak into the cities where generations of free blacks had built their schools, churches, newspapers, and networks of influence. This mass migration brought with it the promise of a broader black freedom, but it also unsettled the delicate balance the elite had worked for decades to maintain. The arrival of thousands who had been denied education, political power, or stable family life under slavery created new social dynamics that demanded patience, vision, and a reimagining of leadership. In neighborhoods from Philadelphia to New York, Boston to Baltimore, the streets that had once echoed with the polite gatherings of a self-assured black middle class now rang with the voices of newcomers seeking work, schooling, and a place to call home. Many of these migrants carried scars, both physical and emotional, from years of forced labor and the traumas of war. Their aspirations for advancement were fierce, yet the obstacles they faced were immense. Housing discrimination, low wages, and the lingering hostility of white neighbors who feared the growth of a black population newly free to move and settle. To the established elite, those who had spent decades proving that black refinement and achievement could match or surpass the standards of any society, this influx was both a call to compassion and a challenge to their carefully nurtured sense of order. For the women and men whose families had long married within a circle of education and property, whose homes had become salons of art and politics, the sudden presence of so many recently freed people tested the boundaries of their identity. Some feared that the prejudices of the wider white society would sharpen again, that the hard-won respect they had cultivated through discipline and accomplishment might be swept aside by those eager to paint all black Americans with the same brush of poverty and ignorance. Yet many among this elite also recognized in the newcomers a mirror of their own ancestors, the first Africans who had arrived in Virginia under contracts before the laws of hereditary slavery, the determined voices who had fought for abolition and equality, the families of mixed heritage who had seized education as a weapon against oppression. They knew that their own dignity had been forged in struggle, and that the newly freed carried the same potential for resilience and greatness. Thus the black elite found themselves walking a delicate line. In private, they held fast to the standards that had sustained their rise: education, moral discipline, and the cultivation of culture. They continued to host lectures, publish newspapers, and encourage their children to pursue higher learning, believing that the stability of their community depended on these values. But in public, they turned outward, stepping into the role of advocates and mentors for those just beginning their journey into freedom. They organized schools and literacy programs, raised funds for churches that could double as meeting halls and community centers, and pressed politicians to protect the rights promised by emancipation. Their efforts reflected not only a sense of duty, but also an understanding that the fate of all black people in America was now inseparably bound together. This balancing act was neither simple nor without tension. Within their own ranks, debates flared about how best to engage with the newcomers, whether to focus on uplifting the masses through direct aid or to protect the social distinctions that gave the elite their influence. Some feared that too close an association might dilute the standards of respectability that had been painstakingly built. Others argued that true leadership demanded solidarity, that their own privilege carried an obligation to those who had been left with nothing. These discussions echoed the long history of black resilience. The early free farmers of Virginia who had once shown that liberty could be earned. The powerful voice of Olaudah Equiano who turned personal emancipation into a platform for global change. And the generations of northern free blacks who had built newspapers and schools as bulwarks against prejudice. Despite the strain, many members of this refined class chose the path of public advocacy. They lobbied for civil rights legislation, confronted the emerging threats of segregation, and used their newspapers to demand equal protection under the law. They welcomed the migrants into their churches and sponsored their children in schools, believing that the education and moral strength that had defined their own success must now be shared. Their parlors, once reserved for intimate gatherings of poets and thinkers, became planning rooms where strategies for political action were drawn, and their own marriages and family ties, symbols of stability and continuity, stood as living proof that freedom could indeed foster order and achievement. Through these efforts, the black elite helped guide an entire people through one of the most dramatic transitions in American history. They did not abandon the private standards that had shaped their character, but neither did they retreat into isolation. Instead, they wove their own story, stretching back to the earliest days of African presence in America into the larger fabric of a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its history. Their ability to balance private refinement with public advocacy became a defining feature of their leadership, showing that the cultivation of culture and the pursuit of justice could, and must, walk hand in hand, by embracing both the newcomers and their own traditions of excellence. This generation of black leaders preserved the achievements of the past while opening doors to a broader future. They proved that freedom, once claimed, demands both vigilance and generosity, and that the true measure of a community lies not only in its capacity to rise, but in its willingness to lift others. Their legacy is one of steadfast courage and nuanced vision, an inheritance of resilience that continues to inspire the ongoing struggle for equality, and the belief that dignity and justice can endure even in the face of the greatest upheavals. From the first Africans who stepped onto the shores of Virginia not as chattel but as contracted workers, to the northern black elite who balanced private refinement with public leadership after the Civil War, the story we have traveled together reveals a long and unbroken tradition of achievement, intellect, and resilience. These men and women, whether seafarers like Olaudah Equiano who transformed his personal emancipation into a worldwide plea for justice, or the mixed heritage families who used education and property to create a distinct class of leaders, or the urban pioneers who built newspapers, schools, and cultural centers, were more than survivors of an oppressive age. They were architects of a vision for the future. Long before the legal end of slavery, they proved through action and character that black excellence did not begin with emancipation. It was already present, quietly shaping the nation's conscience and offering a model of dignity and strength in a world often blind to both. Their lives remind us that progress is rarely a single dramatic moment but a chain of patient, determined efforts. Each generation built upon the sacrifices of the one before it. Early free blacks in Virginia showed that freedom could be claimed through skill and perseverance, even when the law had yet to recognize their humanity. Equiano's eloquent narrative turned personal suffering into a powerful weapon against the slave trade and inspired countless others to see the moral bankruptcy of human bondage. The northern black communities, publishing newspapers and running schools, created an intellectual and cultural foundation that nurtured leaders who would later fight for civil rights. And by the mid-1800s, the black elite demonstrated that refinement and leadership could flourish despite prejudice, offering proof that culture and excellence were not gifts granted by a benevolent society, but the fruits of hard work, discipline, and shared purpose. When the newly freed poured into northern cities after the Civil War, the established black elite welcomed them, at times with hesitation but ultimately with a sense of responsibility. They understood that the destiny of their people depended on unity and mutual uplift. Their ability to balance private standards with public advocacy became a bridge from the earliest pioneers to the towering activists and thinkers of the 20th century, leaders like E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and countless others who carried forward the torch of civil rights and intellectual achievement. The ground had been prepared long before emancipation, and it was these early men and women who laid the stepping stones on which later generations would walk. Today their stories still speak. They tell us that dignity does not wait for permission, that excellence is not defined by the limits others place upon us, and that real change begins with individuals who dare to learn, build, and lead even when the world seems determined to hold them back. Their legacy invites us to see Black history not only as a tale of oppression but also as a testament to creativity, courage, and unshakable hope. By remembering them, we honor the quiet strength that shaped a nation and recognize the roots of leadership and intellect that continue to inspire movements for justice and equality across the globe. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden chapters of our shared past. If you found meaning in these stories and want to help share them with others, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that the lessons of history remain part of our conversations today. As a close, I wish you a peaceful and restful night. May these stories of perseverance and excellence remind you that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can rise and light the way forward. Sleep well, and good night.